Hi guys, this is going to be your reading video for the week of February the 1st. In this story, we're going to be in our new reading booklet, and the title of the new reading booklet is Tales to Live By. This will begin Unit 6. Unit 6 is focused on different cultures and different people and places from around the world. So our essential question for Unit 6 is, what can different cultures teach us? So as we read these stories, a lot of the stories this week are going to be folk tales. Remember that a folk tale is a story that really has no known author. They were stories that were told from one generation to the next, and they were passed down by word of mouth. So these stories originated in different places all around the world, and they have been retold many times over the years. Different folk tales are told to explain why things are the way they are or how things came to be. And so you're going to see in these stories, we're going to think about what different cultures can teach us. Think about what we can learn by learning about different people and different places around the world. In this first story, we're going to begin on page 4. The title of the story is called Village of the Moon Rain. And it says, From Where the Mountain Meets the Moon by Grace Lin. And there's a picture of our author, Grace Lin. So Grace Lin didn't originally write this story, but she heard the story and she has retold it in her own words. It says that Grace Lin is an award-winning writer and illustrator. She came to celebrate her Chinese heritage through the folktale and fairy tale books of her childhood. So she is kind of telling this story from the Chinese culture point of view. As we read this story today, I want us to think about two different things: summarize and synthesize. When we summarize a story, we're briefly retailing the central idea and the important details of a text. We use our own words and we restate what happened at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end of the story. So to summarize a story, I might tell information about the main idea and the key details. I also might tell about the characters, the setting, the problem that the characters had, and then the solution, how they fixed their problem in the end. So those important details would help me to summarize a story. Remember that when we summarize, we don't tell the entire story. We tell the most important parts. Pretend that you have read a story and you want to tell your mom about the story, or maybe you want to tell a friend about the story so that they can also read the story. You wouldn't tell the entire story. You would tell the most important parts. You would tell maybe your favorite parts or what happened in the beginning, the middle, and the end. Those are the way that we summarize a story. Another thing that I want us to think about as we read this story is the word synthesize. To synthesize means to make a connection between the story. When we synthesize, we think about something that we have read or something that is familiar to us in the story that is like what our story is that we're reading today. So we can use this strategy to come up with new ideas and help us to understand a story. If we read a story and we have read a story like this story before, we can synthesize, we can make connections with that story because maybe it's a place we've already heard about, or maybe it is a character that we already know from another story. So when we synthesize, we're making a connection. You might use words like, I used to think this, But now I think this. Or you might say, a new idea I have is this. Or maybe you want to tell what you've learned from the story. So, as we think about synthesizing, we think about something we can learn or something new that comes to our mind based on this new story we've read as we connect it to other things we've learned about. All right, as we look at this story on page 4, I'm going to read the story and go through here, and I want you to help me by following along in your book and reading along as I read. And think about the words summarize and synthesize because we're going to be talking about that today. Here we go. Long ago, everything was gray and cold and ugly, and the land was empty. Then, one day, a strange storm broke out. It's raining pearls, our ancestors said to each other, jewels from the moon. And they rushed out with baskets and bags, catching what they could from the strange storm. Magically, when the raindrops were caught, they didn't disappear, and soon their baskets and bags were full. But in the morning, ancestors saw that the drops were not pearls or jewels. In the sunlight, they saw that they were really seeds. But no one knew what kinds of seeds they were. Curious, they planted them in the hard earth. And as daylight broke over the land, the seedlings grew higher. Soon they grew into beautiful silver trees with golden flowers. They were so beautiful, our ancestors planted more and more seeds, and soon the whole village was blooming with hundreds and hundreds of flowering trees. And since then, our home has been called the Village of the Moon Rain. This story, remember, I told you was a folk tale. Remember that folk tales talk about things from long ago? And in this story, I heard the word ancestors. What do you think the word ancestors means? That's right. Our ancestors are our family members of the past from long ago. So, our relatives that were alive long ago. In this story, I know that this is an older story because it talks about the people's ancestors. I also know that this is a folk tale because it talks about magic and jewels falling from the sky. And I know that that is a story that could not really happen. So these things are made up. And so usually in a folk tale, we find characters that maybe do things or say things that couldn't really happen in real life, or events that happen that involve magic. And so that would be another example of a folk tale. In the end, I read about the flowers and the trees growing as the village plants these beautiful seeds. They grow into beautiful silver trees with golden flowers. And it talks about that soon hundreds of trees were growing and were had flowers. So if I look at this picture, I can see them in the background. Remember that we also said a folk tale also tells how or why something came to be. So maybe this story is trying to teach us how these flowers on these trees came to be and where they come from. Another thing that I notice is at the end of the story it says, and since then, our home has been called the Village of the Moon. This sentence tells me that this story tells me why they're called the Village of the Moon Rain. It tells me how they got their name. So remember, a folk tale tries to explain how or why something came to be or is the way that it is. This story tells us why they are named the name they have. And so as I look at this story, I can think about summarizing and synthesizing. When I read the first paragraphs of the story, I notice there are details and events that are happening. It tells me long ago. It also tells me that they were in a place that was gray, cold, and ugly. The land was empty. I can picture in my mind the setting of this story. I can also picture a storm coming along. So, in these details, I know when the story takes place long ago, and I know that the world was an ugly place. These details help me to understand the beginning of the story, helps me to understand the details. Long ago, the world was a very ugly place, and then there was a storm. That's how I would summarize the beginning. Long ago, the world was an ugly place, and then there was a storm. So I didn't tell every detail that was in the story, but I told basically what happened, the overall main important parts. As I think about paragraph 2, it tells me a storm rained magical raindrops that looked like jewels from the moon. People collected the raindrops. Let's think about how paragraph 2 adds to our understanding of what is happening. We just read that there was a storm. So paragraph 2 describes the storm. So this helps me to understand more about the setting, what's happening in the story, and what things would look like. It is raining pearls and jewels. When I read a story like this, I want to summarize by thinking about the most important events in the story. In the first paragraph, the most important thing was that the story was ugly, or the town, was ugly and cold, and there was a storm. That's the most important part. In the second paragraph, when I summarize, I can tell the most important part was what the storm looked like. It was raining pearls or jewels. In the third paragraph, I read about what happened in the next day. So to summarize this paragraph, I could tell what happened. They noticed the pearls or the jewels were actually seeds. That's the main detail from that paragraph. And in the last paragraph here, I noticed what they did with the seeds. They planted the seeds and trees began to grow. So this detail tells me what happened at the end. I can summarize by telling what happened at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story, and that helps me to think about the main details. When you think about summarizing a story, think about the most important parts, the main things that are happening, not every detail. Let's think about some synthesizing now. How does this story relate to you? Have you ever heard a story like this where you had to think about how something came to be? We've read folk tales before, haven't we? So we can relate to a folk tale teaching us something or telling us how something came to be. How does the title relate to the story? The Village of the Moon Rain. How does the title relate to the story? Well, that's what the village ended up being called, right? That's the name of the Village of the Moon Rain. And because that's exactly what was happening, the moon was raining down the jewels in the story. So that helps me to know what was happening in the story. We're going to continue to learn more about folk tales this week. And we are also going to continue to talk about summarizing and synthesizing. Remember that when you read a story, to summarize, you tell the most important parts, the key details. You might even talk about the characters and the setting and the plot. But more than likely, you're going to think about what's the most important thing that happened in the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. So we're going to continue to practice that this week. I hope you keep reading, and we will learn more next time.